Welcome to Sleepy Case Files, a place where quiet storytelling meets mysterious cases. Tonight, we slowly explore a story from the world of true crime.
There exists a specific category of silence that belongs entirely to the deep woods during the dead of winter. It is not merely an absence of auditory stimuli, but rather a heavy, oppressive blanket that absorbs everything into its frozen landscape. In the early months of 1922, the Bavarian forest wrapped this profound stillness around a small, isolated farmstead known as Hinterkaifeck. To truly understand the profound tragedy that unfolded within those wooden walls, we must intentionally shift our analytical framework. We must pivot away from the conventional true crime focus on police reports, forensic limitations, and endless lists of suspects. Instead, we will examine this historical anomaly through the lens of environmental psychology, territorial invasion, and the macabre concept of domestic mimicry. This is not simply a recounting of a rural crime. It is a clinical, deeply unnerving study of a sanctuary slowly being consumed by an unseen, parasitic presence. The farmstead, situated roughly 1 kilometer from the nearest main village, functioned essentially as a solitary island in a vast sea of dark, towering pines. It housed a family of 6. At the head of the household was Andreas Gruber, a man of 72 years whose reputation was steeped in authoritarian control and deliberate social isolation. He lived with his 72-year-old wife, Kazilia, their 35-year-old widowed daughter, Victoria, and Victoria's 2 children, a 7-year-old girl named Kazilia, and a 2-year-old boy named Joseph. On the final day of their lives, they were joined by a new maid, a 44-year-old woman named Maria Baumgartner. Andreas Gruber had intentionally constructed a life completely disconnected from the surrounding community. He desired absolute privacy, demanding total self-sufficiency from his land and his family. However, this extreme isolation meant to serve as a defensive fortress against the outside world, fundamentally altered the psychological dynamics of the space. When a home is entirely cut off from the watchful eyes of the neighbors, it ceases to be a haven and transforms into a vulnerability. The farm became a reverse panopticon. Instead of a central authority observing the inmates, the dense surrounding forest allowed any hidden observer to monitor the family's every movement with absolute impunity. The Grubers were entirely exposed to the darkness, while the darkness remained utterly impenetrable to them. The narrative of this invasion did not begin with a sudden, violent breach. Instead, the boundary between the safe interior and the wild exterior eroded imperceptibly over several months, exactly 6 months prior to the primary event. The family's previous maid abruptly resigned and fled the property. Her reasons were consistently dismissed by the surrounding villagers as simple, rural superstition, but her claims were deeply rooted in auditory reality. She reported hearing relentless, inexplicable sounds emanating from the attic, footsteps that did not belong to any of the 6 residents, whispers drifting down through the wooden ceiling boards, and a pervasive, suffocating feeling of being constantly watched. She categorized the farmstead as haunted. In modern psychological terms, she was experiencing the acute dread of an unacknowledged spatial violation. Someone, or something, had already breached the perimeter. As the severe winter of 1922 began to thaw into early spring, the anomalies escalated from auditory phantoms to undeniable physical artifacts. Andreas Gruber, despite his stubborn nature, could no longer ignore the decaying reality around him. He discovered a strange newspaper originating from Munich on his property, a publication that no one in the household subscribed to, nor had anyone brought from town. It was a completely alien object, dropped casually into their secluded reality. It served as a physical manifestation of an external presence boldly announcing itself. Then came the most chilling discovery, an event that perfectly illustrates the psychological paralysis induced by a slow invasion. While walking the perimeter of his property following a fresh snowfall, Andreas observed a distinct set of footprints. They emerged from the dense tree line, cutting a deliberate straight path across the pristine white surface, leading directly toward the heavy wooden doors of the machine room attached to the house. The profound horror of this discovery lay not in the footprints themselves, but in their trajectory. There was only one set of tracks. They led exclusively inward. There were no footprints leading back out toward the forest. The entity had crossed the threshold, transitioning from a voyeur in the woods to a resident within the architecture. Yet strangely, Andreas did not immediately involve local authorities. Perhaps it was his deep-seated distrust of outsiders, or perhaps it was a profound psychological denial. To admit that his fortress had been breached was to admit a complete loss of control. He chose to remain silent, inadvertently sealing the fate of the 6 individuals residing under that roof. In the days that followed, keys to vital doors vanished without explanation. Fresh scratches appeared on the lock of the machine room. The architecture of the house itself felt actively hostile, harboring a secret tenant in the cold, dark spaces just above their heads. The culmination of this psychological torment occurred on Friday, March 31st. This date marked the arrival of the new maid, Maria, who tragically walked directly into an active, escalating situation. The events of that evening demonstrate a terrifying level of strategic control exerted by the intruder. The perpetrator did not engage in a chaotic, emotional assault within the main living quarters. Instead, the individual utilized the layout of the farmstead as a mechanical trap. Through methods that remain completely unknown, the unseen resident managed to lure 4 members of the family out of the warm, secure house and into the cold, cavernous space of the barn. They were drawn out individually, separated from the collective safety of the group. Andreas, his wife Kazilia, their daughter Victoria, and the young 7-year-old Kazilia were each guided into the agricultural structure one by one. The sheer methodical nature of this extraction suggests the perpetrator possessed a deep understanding of the family's routines and internal dynamics. Once isolated in the barn, they were systematically struck down with a heavy farming implement, likely a mattock belonging to the family. Following the eradication of the 4 individuals in the barn, the perpetrator silently traversed the connecting corridor into the main living quarters. There, the individual concluded the grim task, finding the new maid Maria in her bedchamber, and finally the 2-year-old Joseph asleep in a small cot situated in his mother's room. In a matter of hours, a farmstead that had bustled with the heavy labor of 6 human lives was reduced to complete, absolute stillness. The heavy winter blanket of silence that usually surrounded the farm now penetrated its very core. However, it is the sequence of events immediately following March 31st that elevates the Hinterkaifeck case from a standard historical murder mystery into a deeply unsettling psychological phenomenon. In virtually all documented cases of rural home invasions or violent robberies, the primary objective of the perpetrator is immediate extraction. Criminals seek to maximize the distance between themselves and the geographic location of their actions. They utilize the cover of night to flee. The entity at Hinterkaifeck made an entirely different, incredibly bizarre decision. The intruder decided to stay for a period encompassing 3 full days and 4 agonizingly quiet nights. The individual remained embedded within the architecture of the farmstead. The killer did not merely hide. The killer fundamentally adopted the domestic routine of the family they had just violently displaced. This represents a chilling manifestation of domestic mimicry. The perpetrator stepped seamlessly into the void left by Andreas Gruber. During this extended period, the individual routinely fed the remaining livestock in the barn, moving just feet away from the concealed remains of the 4 victims. They milked the cows at the correct agricultural intervals, ensuring the animals did not suffer from neglect. The killer ventured into the kitchen, utilizing the family's provisions to prepare meals. They consumed bread, carved meat from the pantry, and likely sat at the very wooden table where the family had shared their final supper. Most unnervingly, the individual diligently maintained the fires within the hearths. This specific action, keeping the fires burning, served a dual purpose. Practically, it provided warmth in the freezing Bavarian spring. Psychologically, it acted as an incredibly effective optical illusion projected outward toward the distant village. When the neighbors glanced toward the isolated farmstead across the snowy fields, they observed a steady, comforting stream of gray smoke rising from the chimney into the winter sky. This visual cue communicated a false narrative of unbroken routine and pastoral tranquility. The smoke was a lie written in the atmosphere, assuring the community that the Gruber family was simply going about their isolated business, while in reality, a phantom resident was orchestrating a macabre pantomime of domestic life inside. The psychology required to execute this level of mimicry is staggering. It requires a profound detachment from the immediate physical reality of the environment. To sleep in a house containing 6 deceased individuals, to hear the soft shifting of the cattle in the adjacent barn, and to calmly prepare a morning meal requires an individual whose mind operates completely outside the boundaries of conventional human empathy or fear. The killer transformed Hinterkaifeck into a private theater, acting out the role of a diligent farmer in a script of their own dark design. The house, with its thick walls and isolated location, became an unwitting accomplice, shielding this surreal performance from any external interruption. This bizarre illusion of normalcy held strong until Tuesday, April 4th. The outside world, driven by minor disruptions in the social fabric, finally decided to penetrate the farm's perimeter. Young Kazelia had accumulated multiple unexcused absences from the local schoolhouse, missing classes for several consecutive days. Furthermore, the mail carrier noted that the postal deliveries for the Gruber family had remained entirely untouched, gathering physical dust where they had been left over the weekend. A repairman had also visited the property to fix a mechanical engine, spent hours working in the courtyard, and departed without ever encountering a single living human being, though he noted the farm dog was securely tied and the animal seemed calm, driven by an escalating sense of communal unease. A group consisting of 3 local men finally embarked on the short journey from the village to investigate the silent farmstead. As they approached the property, the heavy silence of the environment seemed fundamentally different than usual. It was no longer the peaceful quiet of rural life, but the dense, stagnant air of an abandoned space. Upon forcing entry into the barn, the illusion meticulously crafted by the mimic was instantly shattered. The men discovered the grim reality carefully concealed beneath layers of hay and an old wooden door. The subsequent search of the house revealed the remaining tragedy. The authorities were summoned, and the pristine, isolated environment was rapidly flooded with investigators, curious neighbors, and local journalists. The reverse panopticon was broken. The world was finally looking inside. Yet, despite an overwhelming influx of police resources, the interrogation of over 100 suspects throughout the decades, and countless analytical theories, the identity of the mimic remains completely unverified. The individual who crossed the snowy threshold lived as a phantom within the architecture and seamlessly vanished back into the Bavarian landscape, left behind no definitive identity. They left only questions regarding the nature of isolation, the vulnerability of the spaces we call safe, and the terrifying capacity for a human being to comfortably inhabit the immediate aftermath of profound destruction. The structures of Hinterkaifeck were eventually dismantled, torn down piece by piece the following year as if to erase the architectural memory of the event. A simple stone monument now stands in the empty field, surrounded once again by the deep, silent woods. When the winter snow falls on that specific patch of German soil, covering the ground in an unbroken layer of white, it is easy to imagine that somewhere just beyond the tree line, a single set of footprints is waiting to begin a slow, inevitable march toward an unsuspecting threshold. The physical house is gone, but the heavy, expectant silence of the landscape remains eternally undisturbed, holding on to its dark, century-old secret.